Hello, love bugs. This is Nick.
And this is Andy, and we host The Concession Stand, a podcast from two guys who work in the TV and movie business right here in Los Angeles.
And you're listening to the Dirty Bits podcast on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, and you're listening to Dirty Bits, the show that explores the sexy, scandalous, and salacious stories your history teacher probably left out. If you're a love bug or a dirty birdie, as we call our Patreon supporters, stay tuned after this episode for listener shoutouts, special insider info, and podcast recommendations from the Dirty Bits newsroom you won't want to miss. Enjoy the show. Previously on Taking on the Tudors. In 1385, Isabeau of Bavaria marries King Charles VI of France. They have a bunch of kids, and he starts struggling with what is likely schizophrenia. Their daughter, Catherine Valois, marries Henry V, King of England. She has one kid with him who grows up to become King Henry VI. When her husband dies, she has a kid with her boyfriend, who may have secretly been her husband, Owen Tudor. They name their son Edmund Tudor. So Catherine's son, Henry VI, dies, and Edward York becomes king. A few years pass, and Catherine's son, Edmund, has a kid who naps the throne in 1485 and becomes Henry VII. None of these people had particularly interesting sex lives that survived history, so we glossed over most of that. Henry VIII surprisingly becomes king after his older brother dies, and he marries his widow, Catherine of Aragon. They have a daughter, Mary Tudor, but no sons. He soon learns that he can chop off the heads of people standing in his way, develops a lady-in-waiting fetish, sleeps around, starts his own church so he can do whatever the hell he wants, and divorces his wife. He goes through another 5 wives, fathering Elizabeth I and Edward VII before dying from multiple health complications. So Edward is all of 9 years old when he's crowned King of England. And remember, his mom was Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, and the one who probably would have done a banging job at queening. Edward and his dad were buds because of the whole male heir thing. There's an older perception that Edward was sickly, which I definitely believed because like every geeky history child, I obsessively read the Royal Diary series by Scholastic. But it turns out that historians are now saying that Edward wasn't that sick at all. He had a fever here and there, and his eyes weren't great, but he wasn't this frail child as previously thought. His older sister Mary was not buds with their father. When he divorced her mom, Catherine of Aragon, they had this huge falling out, of course. He was like, "You're not a princess anymore, and your mom isn't queen." And Mary and Catherine said, "You can't just make up your own religion with your own rules." To which Henry VIII said, "Oh, can't I?" So he separates the two from each other when Mary is just 15. He declares her illegitimate, and this means Queen of England won't be her future job title. So she wasn't Princess Mary anymore. She was just Lady Mary, which is bonkers insulting, like fired from your job in front of all your co-workers level of embarrassment. Mary naturally gets defensive and refuses to acknowledge her little sister as princess or her stepmother as queen, which sends Henry VIII into a blind rage. They had a horrible father-daughter relationship and didn't speak for 3 years. He wouldn't even go let her visit her mom despite the fact that both Mary and Catherine of Aragon were terribly ill. But then it ends up not even mattering, because Queen Anne gets the axe for all the TMZ rumors going around about her sleeping with her brother like she's 16th century Angelina Jolie, and her daughter Elizabeth is also declared illegitimate when she's about 3 years old. When Elizabeth turns 14, her stepmother, Catherine Parr, wife of the late Henry VIII, marries Thomas Seymour, who's the brother of the Lord Protector, who is top dog until Edward is of ruling age. Catherine had Elizabeth come live with them, and they were pretty icky with the teenager. Thomas Seymour was this George Clooney silver fox type who creeped on Elizabeth, and his wife knew about it, and even took part with him. until she caught them hugging it out one day and got jelly, so she kicked her stepdaughter out, like a real champ. But the guy doesn't quit. After Catherine Parr dies in childbirth, he again sets his beady little eyes on Elizabeth, planning on marrying her. However, everyone finds out what a skeevy little weasel Thomas Seymour is, and he's arrested for plotting to marry Elizabeth and get rid of the Lord Protector. Then Elizabeth, who's just 16 years old, is arrested for conspiring with him. And she totally gives these men the runaround who are interrogating her for weeks like a total hard ass. She admitted to absolutely nothing and ran circles around these guys with her logical reasoning, wit, and just blatant defiance, which isn't surprising if you know that she was both one of the most educated women in Europe as well as the most intelligent. You can just see her leaning back in her chair and putting her hands behind her head like a boss. I'm not saying she wore sunglasses and smoked a cigarette like Don Draper, but I wanted that image in your head when you're picturing her from here on out. So King Edward VI gets a lung infection and dies when he's 15. He didn't have a long reign, and it's hard to give praise or blame to a ruler at such a young age. So in my dirty little opinion, it's important instead to blame the regents for anything that occurred on an underage monarch's watch. And kind of a lot of shady shiz happened when the adults in his life were running the show. There were riots, rebellions, and economic problems punctuated by this Scottish war that was positively hemorrhaging money. Edward was also very religious and was the first English monarch to be raised as a Protestant. It was during his rule that the Reformation occurred, and England became a largely Protestant country. This was an issue when it came to who would rule after he realized that he wasn't going to get any better. He didn't want his sister Mary to take over, not only because she was about as Catholic as the Pope, but because he took after his father in believing that Mary was a bastard. So Edward writes up his will and is like, "My sisters don't get jack shit. Leave everything to my 16-year-old cousin, Lady Jane Grey." But when Jane is proclaimed queen, Mary sends the council a message saying, "I know y'all are just following orders, but I'm actually queen. Henry was my dad, and my mom was his wife. I have way more claim to the throne than this chick." And the council responds with, "Yeah, you're right, we're following orders, and orders say you aren't queen. Sorry, not sorry. The only people who like you are lewd-based people." And Mary reels back like, "Oh, I am not going to lie down and take this. Hey, advisor, supporter people, get me an army." So she pulls up with this huge military force and goes, "Hey, I'm taking over, Lady Jane. Get out of my chair, you're going to prison." And they escort Lady Jane Grey to the Tower, where she was eventually executed because letting her live was obviously way too high of a risk. Now Mary, as mentioned, was like super Catholic, and most of England was Protestant, including her half-sister Elizabeth. At first, Mary's like, "Don't worry guys, you don't have to be Catholic just because I am, it's totally cool." But then she turns around and throws all these big Protestant leaders in jail. She brings back the heresy acts that her father had gotten rid of, starts making everyone go to Catholic Mass, and, possibly worst of all, marries a Catholic Spanish prince. And everyone's like, wait, what? And then she just starts kicking people out of the country or burning them at the stake, killing 283 people. She became known as Bloody Mary. So people are sick of Mary's shit, and they start sending all these messages to her sister Elizabeth, like, "Hey, Lizzie, you need to do something about your sister. You're Protestant. That jives with us. Can you actually do the ruling stuff here?" And Elizabeth goes, "I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no," which results in her being put under house arrest. But people were cheering for her in the streets and saying all this like really sweet, encouraging stuff, like, "You got this, girl. You're our favorite. We're with you." But when Mary keeps having all of these false pregnancies, as they're called, she has this moment of radical acceptance and says, "I don't think I can have kids, guys. And believe me, it's not from lack of trying. I have to pass the torch over to my bitch of a sister. I don't see any other option." And Mary's husband goes, yeah, that's probably a good idea. She's way easier to work with than you anyway. Okay, cool, let's do it. So Mary dies just a couple of weeks later from either cancer or ovarian cysts, and Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England. About all of 5 seconds pass when she's at her new job before people start asking, so when are you getting married? And Elizabeth is like, oh, you know, soon. But she never married, which was a huge, shocking scandal at the time. She became known as the Virgin Queen. But like a lot of history, there's much speculation surrounding what actually went down. Some say she did indeed remain celibate her entire life, and was put off from relationships because of her stepmother's icky husband. Rumors spread by Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots herself, said she was friends with benefits with Sir Christopher Hatton, who she gave all these promotions to. And they were without a doubt really close. Like, really close. There are these letters between them where she calls him my lad, and he refers to himself as her lamb. Saucy. They supposedly had a relationship from 1587 to 1591. Hatton remained unmarried, but is believed to have had an illegitimate daughter. Then there was this other guy, Sir Walter Raleigh, who married her lady-in-waiting without her permission, so she had both of them imprisoned in the Tower, which has led some to believe that they were having a roll in the hay. But there isn't a ton of evidence there either that reveals a relationship one way or the other. However, her childhood friend, Robert Dudley, seems to have very possibly been in a long-term relationship with the Queen of England. During almost his entire career, he lived away from his wife, and very close to the Queen. His wife was dying alone of cancer in their castle, while Robert was hanging out with his bestie, Elizabeth. She supposedly engaged in blatant PDA with her favorite guy, and kept a picture of him in her bedroom. The relationship was gossiped about constantly, and it seems like it may not have been all that secret, with one of her friends saying, "There is not a man who does not cry out on him, and her with indignation. She will marry none but the favored Robert." And then, one day, in what would be an amazing true crime episode if any of my pod sisters want to get on this, Robert Dudley's wife was found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs in her house. Everyone starts whispering, "He pushed a bitch. Oh, he totally pushed her. I think Elizabeth pushed her. I'm voting for Elizabeth for queen just because she pushed her." The couple had a lot going against them. William Cecil, the Queen's principal secretary, was said to have felt super insecure about Robert Dudley becoming king, and was the gossipy bitch behind all the rumors. He had known about Robert's wife's death before it hit the news. He had begun spreading rumors that him and Elizabeth were wanting to get married and were planning on offing Robert's wife. Then the English ambassador in France, who was also opposed to the Queen's relationship with Robert, started in on the smear campaign as well. He went out of his way to draw attention to the relationship, spamming everyone on Facebook, taking out billboard ads and podcast ads, the whole 9 yards. Anytime someone was talking about it in the court in France, his little head would pop up like a meerkat, and he'd be like, "Did you say Queen Elizabeth killed Robert Dudley's wife so they could get married? Is that what you said? Did anyone else hear that?" And what's really messed up is that most of the people spreading the rumors didn't even believe the lies they were saying. They supposedly knew that Dudley and the Queen were both innocent, and that Robert's wife had likely fallen down the stairs in what was an honest accident. They were just trying to destroy the couple's relationship for their own political gain. So even if they were together and had planned on marrying when Robert's wife passed away from cancer, which is still honestly kind of a shitty thing to do, they couldn't get married now because it would look shady as hell. Robert Dudley was found innocent, but his and Elizabeth's reputations took a massive hit. Even after they broke up, Elizabeth was said to have still been very possessive and jealous of Robert. He had actually gone on to marry her cousin, who looked an awful lot like her. When the Queen found out about their secret marriage, she absolutely lost it. She banished her cousin permanently from court, never forgave her, possibly called her a she-wolf, and never accepted their marriage. By the time Elizabeth reached 60, she had successfully evaded matrimony. She had this little game she'd play with everyone where she'd swipe right, pretend to be incredibly interested in these suitable suitors, and then at the last minute, bail like a genius. Everyone was starting to realize that any opportunities for foreign alliances via a wedding or an heir were now off the table. And it seems that Elizabeth was in party mode. She very well may have played the part of the cougar if rumors are true, and she started getting freaky in the sack with Robert Dudley's stepson, Robert Devereux. He was this incredibly hot, incredibly arrogant frat boy who charmed the pantaloons right off the aging monarch. He was supposedly a total douche, and said and did things that would have had other people at the very least banished, if not executed. She absolutely doted on him, and he seemed to want people to think of him as more than just a pretty face, a piece of arm candy, if you will. So he tried to lead these big military expeditions, and used Elizabeth in a bid to become this powerful, macho man. But Elizabeth basically told him to just shut up and keep cleaning the pool in his Speedo while she sipped a cool beverage under the cabana. He then made the mistake of screwing up a major military campaign in Ireland, and walking in on the Queen mostly naked and without her wig on. She understandably then had him executed. As Elizabeth grew older, her friends started dying. This sunk her into a deep depression, and she would just sit on the couch for hours, staring off into space and not saying anything. When her buddy told her she really needed to go back to bed and get some sleep, she clapped back with, "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man." She passed away a short time later, effectively ending the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth was religiously tolerant, didn't actively persecute anyone in regards to religion. Theater flourished during her reign, and her defeat of the Spanish Armada is one of the greatest victories in England's military history. However, she's also considered short-tempered, indecisive, and just plain lucky by many historians. Near the time of her death, multiple economic and military snafus had hurt her popularity. But despite all of that, she remains a prominent and beloved figure to this day. To sum it all up into one dirty little bit, the Tudor dynasty has its roots in the French house of Valois, which dates all the way back to the year 1270. About 100 years later, in 1368, Charles VI, the Mad King, has a kid with Isabeau of Bavaria. That kid is Catherine Valois. She goes and marries the King of England. They have a kid together. They call Henry. Catherine has another kid with her boyfriend after her husband dies, with a guy named Owen Tudor. Her first son becomes King Henry VI, the King of England. Her other son has a kid named Henry, who later becomes King Henry VII. Henry VII was pretty boring, but he did father King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII wasn't supposed to be king. His older brother Arthur was. But when Arthur unexpectedly dies, the ill-prepared Henry becomes king, and also marries Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. They have one kid together, Mary Tudor. After Catherine fails to give him a son, and Henry becomes whipped by Anne Boleyn, he pieces out with the Catholic Church, who won't grant him a divorce, and starts his own religion. He says his first marriage was never for realsies, and his daughter isn't his real daughter either, who could ever be considered for the crown in any way, shape, or form. So Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn, who was rude enough not to give him a son, just a daughter named Elizabeth. Anne was accused of sleeping with everyone and their brother. And her brother. So Henry morphs into the Red Queen, and her head is removed. Elizabeth gets the same treatment as her half-sister, and also has to change her last name to Snow. Henry then marries Jane Seymour, who finally gives him the man-child he so desperately wants, and then she dies shortly after. 3 years after her death, Henry marries wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, who looked nothing like her picture. Henry proposes divorce, and Anne is sharp enough to know not to argue, and she has a pretty nice life as his good friend for the rest of their lives. The king then marries his ex's lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, which turned out to be a total shit show. She likely was cheating on the king, and she had her head lopped off shortly after becoming the queen. The sixth and final wife of Henry VIII was Catherine Parr, who did a pretty decent job of taking the Anne of Cleves route by playing her cards right. She outlived Henry, remarried, and may have engaged in some intensely inappropriate behavior with her stepdaughter, Elizabeth, alongside her second husband. Elizabeth becomes queen after both her siblings take a whack at it, and never marries, which positively flummoxed everyone in the kingdom. She may or may not have been a virgin her entire life, with evidence strongly suggesting she was at least somewhat romantically involved with a few men. She did a so-so job at ruling, with a few problems here and there, was incredibly well educated, and ended the Tudor reign with her death. And that wraps up all of the salacious and scandalous tales from the House of Tudor. Thank you for joining us these past weeks as we took on the Tudors. As always, we love our community of listeners and appreciate any comments, corrections, suggestions, or ideas you have for us. Feel free to contact us by sending an email to tawny@tawnyvoice.com or just hitting us up on social media. See you next Tuesday. The following may make your head pop unless you're a Dirty Bits podcast fan that can differentiate between a love bug and a dirty birdie. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Dirty Bits Newsroom, the after show that updates our hardcore fans that we love the most on all the fun and exciting upcoming features on the show. As many of you know, we've recently joined the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We're proud to be a part of a wonderful pod family and have some brothers and sisters on the network we think you'd positively adore. Visit orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can discover high-quality, entertaining, and educational shows like Insight and Insight Junior, 4-1 Owned, Historium, The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Is This Adulting?, California Dreaming, and the Super Nerds UK. OrbitalJigsaw.com is also now home to the Dirty Bits merchandise store, where you can find positively adorbs swag like phone cases, stickers, t-shirts, baby onesies, mugs, notebooks, and much more. Be sure to join us on social media, where we'll be doing giveaways of exciting new merchandise every week. When you sign up for our email list, you'll automatically be entered to win positively adorbs merchandise from ATH Fiber Arts or goodies from our very own Dirty Bits merchandise selection. We love talking with our listeners and would be delighted if you joined in with us. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/dirtybitspodcast and in our Facebook discussion group, the Dirty Bits Podcast Group, where we post art history memes and talk about all things historically filthy. You can also connect with us on Instagram at Dirty Bits Podcast and Twitter at The Dirty Bits Pod. We'd be positively overjoyed if you let us know how we're doing by leaving us a review on Facebook, iTunes, or just shooting an email over to tawny@tawnyvoice.com. You might even get a shout out on our next episode. We'd like to take a moment to say thank you for this lovely review from our new friends at the Positively Delightful Hillbilly Podcast. The review says, "Finally, a history podcast that shares info that I care about. There is no other podcast like this. Tawny and George do such a great job. I can't wait for the new episodes. Jerry and Tracy from Hillbilly Horror Stories." Just so you know, we're blushing over here on our end. Thank you so much for the kind words. The feeling is absolutely mutual, and we can't wait to listen to more Hillbilly Horror Stories. All of our links are available in the show notes here and on our fabulous network's website, orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can find all of our pod brothers and pod sisters. Many of you have requested longer, bigger, more frequent episodes. You may have noticed since we joined the Orbital Jigsaw Network and have started our Patreon, our episodes have gone from an average of 15 minutes in length to over 20 minutes in length. This wouldn't be possible without all of your support for the show. We would absolutely love to do this for you dirty birdies and love bugs full time. If that's something you would like to see, you can help us work towards making that a reality by visiting us at patreon.com/dirtybits and becoming an official Dirty Birdie. Every donation is a step towards achieving our goal of bringing more to the show, like animation, merchandise, live shows, tours, and much more. A giant thank you to our newest Dirty Birdies, Kelly P., Roseanne S., Carrie G., Samantha H., and Michelle G., who have all donated on Patreon. We are seriously overwhelmed by your generosity and are so excited to start sending you all of the patron-only goodies for your enjoyment. Every one of your contributions to the show means so much, especially to those who aren't able to donate. George and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Thank you for listening to these important updates from the Dirty Bits newsroom, love bugs, and dirty birdies.